So thanks for joining. We are at the office at Wellness for Life Chiropractic in Cumming, Georgia, where we do a holistic practice. We help people restore their health by addressing the chemical, the structural, and the emotional. And today we're going to talk about the nutritional chemical aspect and specifically about sugar. So if you have a computer, well, I'm going to be showing you some graphics. So if you can enlarge this, you'll probably get more out of the presentation. So here's the U.S. sugar consumption from 1820 through early 2000s. And it's always hard to find exact numbers because you don't know exactly what they're counting, but we still see the basic trend here. And when I look at these, I'm always curious why does it look like this? Why did it go the other way a few times? And it's kind of interesting because right here, where there's a big dip around 1860 is the Civil War, and then there's a big dip around 1929 when we had the Big Depression, and then there's next big dip is World War II. But other than that, it's been a pretty steady climb. And today we're eating upwards of 150 pounds of sugar and processed sweet stuff per person per year. And here's a little quote. "We are beyond question the greatest sugar consumers in the world, and many of our diseases may be attributed to too free a use of sweet food." So when I see a quote like that, I always wonder, when did they do that? And this was in the New York Times, May 22nd. Anyone want to guess what year?
1920.
1857. All right? So sugar's not a new thing. And already around 1850, they had started noticing health effects, diseases being caused by this. So if they were noticing effects, then what do you think is going on now? So we eat about 150 pounds per person per year. That's about 187 grams a day. That is almost half a pound. It's like 4/5 of a pound per person per day. And I don't eat any. I'm at like a teaspoon or less, so someone is eating my part as well. That's about 746 calories a day from pure sugar. Now, what is sugar? So a lot of people, they think it's just the white stuff that comes in a bag, and they say, oh, well, I don't eat any of that. So let's just take this from the beginning. So sugar, in its simplest form, is called glucose. That's the stuff that we have circulating in the bloodstream. When we talk about blood sugar, we're talking about blood glucose. And we're representing that with a hexagon because it's a 6-carbon ring. Another common one, so the most common 6-carbon rings is glucose and galactose that we get from breaking down lactose. And then there's a 5-carbon ring called fructose. And this still has 6 carbons because there's a little attachment on one of these corners. So these two, they are what's called monosugars. There is just one unit for each sugar, and that means there is no digestion required. That's why they get into the bloodstream so quickly, because they don't even have to make it down to the small intestine. They get absorbed right after they leave the stomach, and they're in the first part of the small intestine, the jejunum, then they get absorbed. So we don't have any enzyme requirements. The glucose goes straight into the bloodstream, and the fructose gets into the bloodstream, but it can't get into the cell. It's a different animal. That's why fructose has less of a blood sugar impact, because it has to get through the liver and be processed through another pathway. So these are the two types that we should eat primarily, and we'll come to the reasons why. But in nature, these occur primarily in fruits and vegetables in relatively small amounts. Then if we put two of these together, we put a glucose and a fructose together, we have a disaccharide. And this is sucrose, that's white table sugar. Lactose is in dairy products, and maltose is a disugar that we get from starches. And a starch is when we take dozens or hundreds or thousands of these little rings and we hook them together. Plants, starchy plants do that for us. Then we get a starch, and when we break down starch, it turns into maltose. So then starches turn into disaccharides, and they still require digestion. So these two, no digestion. These are only going to break up if we have enzymes present. So that's really important. And we're going to come back to this and explain why all this matters and where it matters. So the first way that sugar is a bad idea is that they're empty calories. And what does that mean? Everyone's heard of empty calories, and I saw one explanation that says, oh, well, whatever you eat of empty calories means it takes up space for things that could have had nutrition. And that's true, but it's way worse than that. So when we say empty calories, we're talking about things that have been processed to the point that have virtually no nutrition. White flour is close to that, but the worst ones are sugar and high fructose corn syrup. They have no nutrients. White flour has a tiny little bit, but most of the life-sustaining value has been removed. So sugar, meaning all these three things, has nutrients removed, but the body requires nutrients to metabolize this sugar. In order for you to use that sugar and turn it into energy, you have to have the nutrients. But the nutrients were removed in the processing. So where's the body going to get them? It's going to borrow, it's going to steal from the existing pool of nutrients that you have in your body and in your cells. And if you start stealing from other tissues, if you steal from other cells, you start getting deficiencies. If you start having deficiencies, you get degeneration and disease. So we mentioned this before, I'm going to make a big point of it. A deficiency is something that you have to have that you're not getting. Something that's essential for life, you're not getting. All right, I think we have a question. Are these all 5 questions? All right, that came quickly. Sugar feeds cancer. Yes, it does, and that is part of what we're getting to. Parents are diabetic. Are my genes going to make me prone to get diabetes? You're going to have a little bit of a predisposition, and we talked about this the other day. You have genes give you a health reserve. It gives you a certain amount of capacity to handle stressors. So whatever amount your parents had, you're likely to have about the same. But if you don't eat the junk, your risk of developing diabetes is basically 0. And explain sugar in coconut water and raw honey. So that comes back to the previous slide, and we'll get back and talk about that. Those sugars are more natural. They are the sugars that we should have, but coconut water is a concentrated form of it. Raw honey is a concentrated form of it. Do these things have some nutrients and some benefits? Yes. In small amounts, they are part of a normal food supply for us. In large amounts, they start burdening the liver because we can handle 20, 30 grams a day from all sources, fruits and vegetables. But once we start adding the high fructose corn syrup and we start loading on the tropical sweet fruits, then we can overdo it with those also. And someone had no carbs for 6 days and lost 15 pounds, wants to lose 150 pounds. So congratulations, good start. And just keep it up. Whatever you do, develop a lifestyle that you can sustain. In the beginning, most of the loss is going to be fluid. but if you keep it up, then you're going to start noticing the weight dropping gradually. Refined white sugar versus cane sugar, very, very little difference. If you have a raw sugar made from cane sugar, then like the little brownish, little pale beige sugar, those have a tiny little bit of nutrients, so they're like that much better than the pure white, but they're still sugar, it's still pure sucrose, it still does most of the issues. Given one or the other, go with the raw, but they're basically the same. All right, so deficiency is something we have to have, we're not getting, develops degeneration and disease. But deficiencies also lead to cravings because your body is looking for fuel and nutrients, and the sugar is only providing the fuel. The body is asking, when am I going to get my nutrients? So if you keep feeding fuel, you're still deficient. Your body says, where's the stuff? You get cravings. And what are you going to crave? Exactly, you're going to crave sugar. So sugar creates a vicious cycle where you never get enough. Your body is always looking for something more, but you're never getting anything. So that's the problem with empty calories, and the end result is degeneration and disease. So we're going to cover several different categories of reasons, but this enough would be a reason enough to not touch the stuff again. 2, sugar feeds your enemies. Who are your enemies? Bacteria, yeast, fungus, parasites, and cancer. Someone asked about cancer. So we're not going to cover it too much, but I'll mention it. So all these are simple parasites, simple creatures. They like simple food. Sugar is the simplest food there is, and the more that you have in your gut, the happier they are. So the first 4 are just pathogens. The cancer is also kind of a primitive organism. It is your body's own cells, but it's kind of defected, and it's a renegade, and it thrives on sugar, and it thrives in an environment even where there is low oxygen. So the body needs oxygen to burn fat. It doesn't need oxygen short term to burn glucose. It can use something called glycolysis, the glycolysis pathway. And cancer is fantastic at breaking down sugar and using it in an oxygen-poor environment. So one of the best ways to combat cancer is to reduce the sugar and increase the oxygen. Sorry, oxygen. Oxygen. You want to oxidize your fats. So these guys like the simple foods, simple organisms, simple foods. So again, this enough would be enough of a reason. So these were quick ones. Now we're going to spend most of the rest of the time on one in particular, and that's what it does to your gut. So dysbiosis is when you have an imbalance in your gut flora. You have all sorts of bacteria in there, and there is a beneficial, there's not really good or bad bacteria, there's just good and bad amounts. So there's certain ones you're supposed to have a lot, and then they're good, and there's others that if you have a little, that's still good, but if they grow, then it's not a good thing.
We're about to get flooded by Neminati.
Okay.
Cricket's going to tell everybody and they're coming over.
All right. Thank you, Cricket. Appreciate that. So some of the things that have been associated with imbalances in gut flora is mental disorders, autoimmunity, autism, allergies, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conditions. You probably heard somewhere that the gut is the origin of everything, and it is so true. And the gut is also has like a direct line to the brain, because everything that happens in the gut gets to the brain eventually. Here's a few gut facts. I knew some of these and I added a few, and they're kind of mind-blowing. There is more bacteria in the gut than there are cells in the body. And I researched this some the other day, and we used to think there were between 50 and 100 trillion cells in the body, and that there were about 10 times as many bacteria, and now they're saying that's not really true. They did a more careful count in the last couple of years, and it turns out we got somewhere around 37 trillion cells in the body, and we got a little bit more than that, like 40, 50-ish trillion bacteria in the gut. But those bacteria, their collective DNA is 150 times more DNA in the foreign bacteria in your gut than you have in the human genome, than you have in your cells. So as a result, 70 to 80% of all the immune cells in your body live in the gut. They're not in your bloodstream, in your cells, in your functional tissue. They're in the tube called the gut to defend you and to balance against foreign invaders. And that's how important the gut is. If your body allocates 70 to 80% of your immune system to it, then it's got to be a big deal. There is up to 1,000 known species of bacteria in the gut. And again, these aren't bad guys. There is stuff like E. coli that is perfectly fine, that performs useful, healthy, life-saving functions if it is maintained in a certain number. But once the conditions change and they start overgrowing, now they can basically kill you. And if the bacteria in your gut are sick, so are you. So now we're going to talk a little bit, and this gets a little bit technical, but bear with me, you're going to love this because it blew my mind when I started understanding this and how it relates to sugar. Yes, question?
Berries, they're low in sugar, so how many per day?
Okay. Berries are, if you're going to eat fruits, berries, vegetables are the best. Berries are by far a close second, and fruits you want to keep to a minimum. So the best berries are blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries and blackberries. So those four. There's somewhere around 10 grams of sugar for half a cup, but they got tons of fiber, and you can eat a good amount of those without overdoing it. So this is what it looks like in your small intestine. These are called intestinal villi. One of these little fingers is called a villus, and this is where actual food absorption is happening. And if you're absorbing any nutrients at all depends on how healthy these guys are. So on the edge here, if you see, they look like little teeth. These are called enterocytes. These are the cells that perform the actual absorption. And then they suck up, they ingest the nutrients from the lumen, and they transmit it into the blood vessels, and it gets into your bloodstream that way. Now, each little cell here is one of these guys. So this is one enterocyte. And the hair is called a brush border. So if you imagine each of these little teeth-looking things have this brush border on them. So this surface is really, really fuzzy. And if you have healthy enterocytes, they're going to have lots and lots of hair like this. And these hairs manufacture, the cell and the hairs, they manufacture and store and keep your digestive enzymes. So if it looks like this, you have lots of digestive enzymes to break down, to finalize the digestion of your food. But if it looks like this, then you don't really have any digestive enzymes there. So let's look at what happens when that's the case. So let's look at carbohydrates. So remember the disaccharides? That's when we have two of those little circles hooked together. So we're assuming that the starch has been broken down earlier in the digestive tract. So the first step of breaking a starch to a disaccharide has happened, and now we got these 2-unit things floating into the small intestine. And an enzyme to break down a disaccharide is simply called a disaccharidase. So that's one of the enzymes, the digestive enzymes that live in the hairs. So this enzyme is supposed to catalyze, it's supposed to make this happen. But if we have an unhealthy gut flora that damages those cells, now we don't have any enzymes, and we don't finalize that last step of digestion. So now all that sugar is still sitting in the gut, and it becomes food for all these opportunistic pathogens. So if you have a course of antibiotics, or if you eat a lot of sugar, that's enough to get this process rolling. And then from that point on, if you keep feeding it sugar, it just keeps getting worse and worse. Now you get pathogen overgrowth. And what do these pathogens do? They have their life to live, and they're having a buffet, and whatever they're doing, whatever their metabolism is doing, there's toxic waste products. They have elimination, just like your body does, and they are eliminating it. They're releasing these toxins right into your gut, and a lot of that gets absorbed, and because your gut isn't so healthy, it gets right into the bloodstream and starts circulating into your brain. And most brain fog and most mental disorders and most autism is probably due to this mechanism. So that's carbohydrates. So we have a crappy gut, we eat sugar, now we get a toxic factory in the gut due to the carbohydrates. Now let's look at proteins. So proteins are, the digestion starts in the stomach. That's why we have acid in the stomach. Your stomach is supposed to be an acid vat. It's about 1 million times more acid than the average in your body. And that starts breaking down the proteins into peptides. So proteins are chains and globular things, clumps of amino acids containing hundreds or thousands of amino acids. And when they start breaking them down, they turn into peptides, that is between 4 and 20 or something like that, units of amino acids. And the enzyme to break down the peptides into individual amino acids is called peptidases. And if that works, we get individual essential amino acids. But again, if we don't have this brush border that's really healthy, then we don't have the digestive enzymes, and the peptides are just floating around. And now we get a deficiency of essential amino acids. Why are they called essential? Because you need them to live. But we also have this overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria from eating the sugar. And these pathogenic bacteria, they release toxins that attack the intestinal lining. So now we get a leaky gut. Your gut's supposed to be really, really tight. It's like a filter with microscopic holes in it that don't let anything through that's larger than an individual amino acid. But now that we get a leaky gut, now these peptides are rushing straight past that intestinal membrane, and now we get allergies. And if you have a leaky gut, a lot of times you're not going to find just 1 or 2 allergies, you're going to find dozens or hundreds. This is the people who run a blood test called an IgG, delayed hypersensitivity test, and it comes back and they're allergic to 57 different things. And they tell them, oh, you can't ever eat these things again. Well, you need food to live, but you can't eat those. So the solution is not to avoid every food on the planet. The solution is to fix the problem. If you have allergies, you also start creating systemic inflammation. You start creating organ inflammation, organ necrosis, which is the foundation, the start of autoimmunity. And autoimmunity today is rampant. We're going to do a separate seminar on that. Let's look at fat. The pathogenic bacteria attack the gut lining, but in addition to creating a leaky gut, you also irritate this gut lining. So it's desperately defending itself. It's not healthy, but it can do something. It can release a lot of mucus. So if it releases excess mucus, this starts coating a lot of different things. And bile is something that's released from your gallbladder. It's like a detergent. It breaks up your fat globules, just like when you do dishes. You have some oil floating on top of the water, you put detergent in, and it dissolves it. That's what bile does. But if you have too much mucus, this is going to cover up the fat globules so that bile can't get to it, and as a result, you can't absorb the fat either. And now you get a deficiency of essential fatty acids. So the excess mucus, that could be, if you notice in your stool, if it's kind of bubbly or slimy, and with the bile blocked and there's too much fat, if you notice that your bowel movement, if it's floating or if it's light colored or pale, those are often signs that you're not digesting any of the fat. So just to summarize, we ate some sugar, we upset the balance in the gut. Oh, so what's the big deal? Now you have a toxic factory in the gut that is spewing out toxins that is spreading via the bloodstream to the brain. You have a deficiency in essential fatty acids. You have a deficiency in essential amino acids. And again, what does essential mean? It means you can't live without it. Deficiency means you gotta have it, you're not getting it, okay? So your body can cope. It can get by, it can survive. It's amazing at surviving, but you can't get back to health. You can't function at your optimum level. You can't heal. You can't do the things that humans are supposed to do. And that's the problem with a lot of the things, that we ignore them because they don't kill us fast enough. If they killed us in a few weeks, we'd pay attention. But if it takes 30, 40 years, then, oh well, it can wait. And you have multiple food intolerances. And for some people, this turns into what's called a universal reactor. Almost everything that you put into your body, you start having a reaction to, because that leaky gut is no kind of barrier at all. Everything you put in gets straight into your bloodstream and you have an immune reaction to it. And you start having a systemic inflammation, which we know is the source of virtually all degenerative disease. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, etc.
So is that the reason for food allergy?
Yes, that's exactly. I had a question here. Is this the reason for food allergies? Absolutely. That is the reason. And you can have, these are not necessarily, they're different levels of allergies. You can have an allergy that leads to an anaphylactic shock. Things like peanuts and shrimp. You have a tiny little piece and you end up in the emergency room. Those are the most extreme form of an allergy reaction. But there are different levels. And some of them aren't necessarily allergies, but they're sensitivities. These things, they don't put you in the emergency room, but they're creating inflammation. Your body is adding to the burden for your body. So we're not going to go on forever. when I did this, I kind of did them in order of importance. So the 1 and the 2 was pretty quick, 3 was a little more involved, and 4 is the big one. But because of how huge this issue with insulin is, I'm not going to go into detail, but we're going to cover just the basics. Then we're going to wrap it up and take some questions. Because insulin, they have been, there's an old saying that money is the root of all evil, and no, it's not. Sugar could really be argued to be the root of all evil as far as health goes. And sugar releases insulin. Sugar leads to high blood sugar, and insulin is required to take it out of the bloodstream and into the cells. And insulin has been associated with virtually every single disease there is, at least every degenerative disease and every degenerative process and condition. You can put insulin in there as a safe bet. So we'll just kind of rattle them off and then talk a little bit more about that. So these are not small things, and there's a definite relationship between every single one of these. So insulin is related to diabetes, inflammation, hormone imbalances, obesity. So a lot of people come in and they ask about, oh, I had this blood test done and my hormones are out of balance, and my doctor wants to give me this, or should I go on, I've heard good things about natural, nature identical hormones. And it's not that there's never a time and place for that, but I would say 99% of hormone imbalances is because insulin causes hormone imbalances. So putting in little bits and pieces, trying to look at your blood work and saying, oh, you need a little bit of this and a little bit of that, then that's kind of trying to push the body into a box, but ignoring the real problem. Obesity, we talked about the other day. Heart disease, uric acid, insulin is related. Sugar increases uric acid, which is related to gout. They always blame the red meat because it has some things. Well, sugar is the big one. High cholesterol. It's not the cholesterol in the food. It's not the saturated fat. It's the insulin. Hypertension, high blood pressure. Stroke, cardiovascular disease. And here's an interesting one. We're not going to go into detail, but it feminizes men. It takes testosterone and turns it into estrogen. So the people, the men with the man boobs, why does that happen to so many people?
Moobs.
What?
Moobs.
Moobs. Yes, man boobs are called moobs. That as people get up in age, they become more insulin resistant and they all develop man boobs. That's the sugar. PCOS. This is a big deal for a lot of women. It's life-changing. It's life-ruining for a lot of women. It affects as much as 10% of the population. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, it is insulin. Irregular periods, fluid retention, fatigue, mood swings, sodium retention, acne, hair loss on the head, and unwanted hair everywhere else. So this side, it's not exclusive, but this side is primarily men, even though most of these fit both men and women. These are primarily women. And this is what testosterone does to a woman. It makes you lose your hair on the head, and it makes it grow everywhere else. So I have an excuse, I'm a man. So it's gone from here and it's coming out nose and ears and everywhere else. That's testosterone. So it turns men into women and it turns women into men. That's what sugar does. They're two different mechanisms, but it works the same way. So this is where the grandkids get confused and they say, I can't tell the difference between grandpa and grandma anymore. Which one is which? Right? It's the cake, it's the sugar, donuts and soda. Uh, so all carbs trigger insulin, no exceptions. Protein triggers a little bit, fat basically none. But we have to understand that all carbs trigger insulin and all plants are carbohydrates. That is how nature does it. Nature takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it takes sunlight from the sun, it takes minerals from the soil, and it turns that into carbohydrates. No exceptions. And all carbohydrates, therefore, are sugar. But like we said, they're not necessarily equally bad. The bad ones are the ones that are really high sugar, really high starch. They create a high insulin response. So potatoes, fries, potato chips, bread, whatever it is made from, whether it's wheat bread or rye bread or gluten-free bread, it is pure starch and it will have an extremely high insulin response. Virtually all bread has a higher insulin response than white sugar. So when they tell you, oh, don't worry, it's a complex carbohydrate, don't believe them. Starches are 10 minutes away from pure sugar. Rye, barley, beer. We did a video on alcohol. So beer is the worst form of alcohol because it has alcohol and grain. And someone was asking about oatmeal, and that comes in here as well. Corn, rice, oats, these are gluten-free grains. So they're better in that sense for most people, but they're still pure starch. Now, if I'm going to eat any form of grain ever off of this list, I would eat steel-cut oats, and I would eat brown rice or wild rice. They're not nearly as bad as some of the white flours and grains, but they're still pure starches. Can steel-cut oats be part of a healthy diet? Yes, as long as you keep the total number down. If you're extremely insulin resistant, like if you've had this going, if you have diabetes or pre-diabetes, and you got some pathology and degeneration going, then you might want to cut it out for 6 months or 2 or 3 years to give your body a chance to recover, because it's so carbohydrate intolerant that any little amount will break it. And sugar, candy, chocolate, obviously, waffles, muffins, Pop-Tarts. And what you're going to find is that as you start weaning yourself off of this, then your taste buds will change. This is a really, really nice thing to understand, to realize that people think, oh, I don't like the taste of that because it's not as sweet as this, or I'm not used to that. Once you start understanding a little bit about habits and neural pathways and neuroplasticity, you understand, and which you can find out about in the other videos, by the way, you understand that everything that you like, everything you know, every habit you have, you learned to like it. You learn to do that habit. So if you just do something else for a couple of weeks, then you'll make new neural pathways that have different perception, that have different preferences. And before long, you'll enjoy things that are 1/3 as sweet. And then you go back to having accidentally a bite of cake at a party and you almost spit it out because it's nauseously sweet. We had a question about noodles and pasta. So that's right up here with the wheat and the bread. There is very, very little difference. It is still a grain, except they ground it up and they mixed it with water and turned it into a paste. It's really the exact same thing. Grains are bad for a couple of different reasons. They are starchy, but they also are very difficult. They're very inflammatory, and they contain things that further the insult on the gut lining, that exaggerate the insult on the gut lining. So if you have a leaky gut and you're trying to restore it, then not only do you want to look at the sugars and the carbs, but you probably want to cut out 100% of the grains. And to this list, we want to add almost anything processed. If it comes in a package, it is depleted, it is filtered, bleached, ground, pulverized, nuked, you name it. And because of that, the particles are reduced to the size where it enters your bloodstream very, very quickly. So from high insulin, we go to low insulin. And so these are the vegetables that you can eat. These are the plants that you can eat virtually unlimited. I would just say if you're trying to get into ketogenesis, there may be some of these that if you build up a mountain that you could get out of ketosis, but these are basically unlimited. Leafy greens, non-starchy vegetables like French green beans, like 2 grams of carbs per 100. But don't eat, this does not include, if you're thinking green beans, don't eat the ones with the big beans, the peas, the seeds inside, because those are starch. And berries, again, we commented on this before. These do have some sugar, so these are not unlimited, but you can eat them regularly in moderation. And again, if you recall, these will have primarily mono sugars. That means they do have a little bit of impact on blood sugar, especially if you juice them, but they get absorbed so quickly that they never make it down to where the bacteria live, that they're not going to act as food for that dysbiosis. And then we have the foods with very low insulin response. So this is, if you're trying to reverse insulin resistance, this is where you want to have most of your foods, which is fat, meat, and eggs. There's more, I just put a few examples, but any kind of natural fat, butter, good quality extra virgin olive oil, coconut oil, lard from a healthy animal, meat, grass-fed meat, fish, chicken from healthy sources, pastured eggs. You can't just look at the label and go, oh, it's free range, because that doesn't really mean much anymore, unfortunately. So animal sources that haven't been processed and good quality from healthy conditions, these are the foods that should be the foundation of your food from a sugar and insulin resistance perspective. Then you fill up with as much leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables as possible. You have an occasional berry, and you stay away from this as much as possible. So the way we handle this, because this can have all sorts of different effects in your body, so we're going to run through just super quick for those that haven't seen it. If you want to come up, we'll do a quick demonstration. So I'm not going to do the whole muscle testing. If you have questions or want to see it, just go back to a previous video of the streams, or one of those that we did separately on muscle testing. So we can ask the body, and it's not a strength test, it's a neurological response. We get a lock or we get an unlock. Your body is an electromagnetic system, it responds to different input. So we can ask about different organs that might have been affected. So if we have an autoimmunity going on, we might want to look at the thyroid, and if there's a problem with the thyroid, then this arm would go down. We could look at cerebellum, we could look at pancreas, and those would be the most common places for autoimmunity. But you could certainly have enough damage that spleen or liver or basically any other organ could show up as a result of this autoimmunity. Then we want to look at anything digestive. And part of the digestion are the organs that part of the endocrine system, because the endocrine system is responsible for stomach acid. So pituitary has a reflex here, thyroid has a reflex here. They're the ones that are primarily responsible for stomach acid, other than, of course, the stomach itself, which we can test. Then there's a couple of digestive points that we can test. And then we have reflex points for the small intestine and all the different parts of the large intestine. Liver is kind of a digestive organ. Gallbladder is a digestive organ. And if you're having, there's the endocrine portion, the hormone sugar handling portion of the pancreas, we can also test over here. So through this, we can kind of get an individualized picture of what kind of damage the sugar has done. And then we can find out specific nutrients, glandular extracts, minerals, homeopathics that your body needs to start recovering. Okay? Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap it up there. In this office, we are chiropractors, we are nutrition response testing practitioners. So chiropractic deals with the structural, nutrition response testing deals with the chemical, both the toxic and the nutritional part. And we also do biofeedback and brain entrainment and things like that to help balance the emotional aspect as well. We use whole food supplements because all nutrition comes from things that have been alive. And the supplements that we buy in the nutrition stores, unfortunately, are just synthetic fractions. They're made in test tubes, they're made by pharmaceutical companies. They're called nutraceuticals. So some people kind of brag and say, oh, this is nutraceutical quality. That's not a good thing. That means it was never alive. It came from a test tube. It probably made from cornstarch or glucose, and it is not sustaining life. So we'll stay on. That concludes our presentation. We're going to come back probably and do a separate one on insulin. Our next one is going to be on Monday. Our next seminar for you guys and for the people online. It's going to be on anxiety and depression. It is on Monday, June 11th. And I don't know offhand what time that is. What did we do on Monday?
Question. There's 2 Swedes in the...
Yeah. Monday, 2 o'clock.
Okay, on Monday, June 11th, it is at 2 p.m. So that would be at 8 p.m. Swedish time. Klockan 8. So I have a question in Swedish here. Vad ska jag äta om jag är och tränar? And that means, what am I supposed to eat if I'm working out? And it depends a little bit on what kind of working out you do. If you're working out for health, or if you're an endurance athlete at a professional level. But basically what they have found is that even though as an athlete you burn off the carbs, they still create most of the problems there that we've talked about. You may not get the extent of the damage because you're younger, you don't have so much degeneration left, but like I found out from eating thousands of calories of grain and sugar daily, that it catches up with you. Sure, you burn it off and you don't associate it with nutritional deficiencies for another 10 or 20 years, but it's just not a great food. So whole food, meat, vegetables, and fat. A lot of bodybuilders and even endurance athletes are finding that a ketogenic diet, which we've done other videos, we'll do some more in this series also, is when you go so low on the carbs that your body learns to use alternate fuels, ketone bodies from fat digestion. And that's the more stable fuel, and it's a better fuel for the body, it's a better fuel for the brain, and if you get your body habituated to that kind of fuel, you're not so dependent on the carbs for the blood sugar swings. Your body gets better at creating long-term energy. I would probably, in response to the question, I would get, if I was training today, I'd get on a ketogenic diet. Then if I felt like I needed a boost somewhere, I'd probably eat some berries. Maybe banana, maybe some fruit. Even though they're starchy, they're natural, they're not depleted, they're not processed, and most of those sugars are going to enter your bloodstream very, very quickly and be available as energy. So again, sugar from an insulin standpoint does not create a problem if you're exercising, because muscles open up those insulin-gated channels. You become more insulin sensitive during exercise. So you don't really have an issue with sugar during exercise as long as it's from a natural source. If you start eating sucrose or sports drinks or candy bars, now you're back to all the other problems we talked about. Ideal diet for cancer or tumor. So again, just want to point out that we don't diagnose or treat disease in any way, but cancer is an extreme form of toxicity. It is where you've had long-term exposure to stressors, or you've had it so early in life that you never really developed any defenses. Like we said, cancer loves sugar and it doesn't like oxygen. If you cut back the sugar and increase the oxygen, such as in moderate exercise and breathing exercises to open up your peripheral circulation, you're increasing the oxygenation. And there's lots of other ways. Study some ways about oxygenation. Chlorophyll is a great thing. The one we use in here is kind of unique. It's called chlorophyll complex. It's the only fat-soluble chlorophyll there is, and it's kind of the only one that works as a detoxifier and to help the body rebuild blood and oxygen delivery. I would recommend maybe go and research something called Gerson diet. I don't agree with it 100%, but I think it has some fantastic ideas in the bottom of it. And what Gerson is based on is juicing. So digestion and repairing takes a lot of energy. And if you want to short-term, now juicing and veganism and cleansing, those can be really, really good short-term. It's not a lifestyle. And juicing is a way to add in tremendous amounts of nutrients, because if you juice vegetables, you can't eat 10 pounds of vegetables, you can juice 10 pounds of vegetables. And then you're freeing up most of the vitamins and minerals in that juice from 10 pounds, and you can ingest it. And like we said, all of these are mono sugars, and the vitamins and minerals are just floating around in this liquid, requiring no digestion, no energy expenditure, no enzymes required. It's absorbed very quickly and very early. So again, you don't want to do it all the time, and there is sort of a balancing because it does have a lot of sugar, but because of the tremendous amount of nutrients, that can have an extremely powerful cleansing effect and also a resting effect on the body. Any more questions? She's shaking her head. Going once. Going twice. All right. Thank you so much for watching and your attention. And tell all your friends in Sweden, because we're doing a lot of these in the middle of the day. So some people here have trouble watching and attending, but it should be easy for you guys. You're 6 hours behind. So June 11th, Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 8 p.m. Swedish time. We're going to talk about anxiety and depression. Thanks so much for watching.